All right, hope everyone had a nice break. My name is Will Harding. I am a manager on the UX team at Living Social. Been there on the design team for about 3 years. Today I'm going to talk about what we call product design. And just recently we started all calling ourselves product designers, mainly because we thought the term UX was nebulous and a little bit overused at this point. And it didn't really encompass everything that we as a design team hope that we can interject into the product development process at Living Social. It's kind of crazy. UX as a term everyone uses it now, and it's happened really fast. And in 2008, I used to call myself a multimedia designer, which today, if I told someone that, they'd probably laugh in my face. But now everyone and their brother is a UX designer, so we wanted to stray away from that. But ultimately, this is not a talk about terms. It doesn't really matter what you call yourself. What I really want to talk about is how we as designers can be a valuable part of every part of the process for product development. So at the beginning, we want to talk about the core tenets of UX design, because this is still a definition that we still hold true at Living Social. And the core tenets of UX design are interaction design, content strategy, information architecture, visual design, and user research. And hopefully this is not really groundbreaking to you guys. But for product design, we think it's more than that. And I was recently at a UIE mobile immersion conference in Denver. This was only a month ago. And Jared Spool was talking there about hiring for designers. And he put up this slide, which I'm going to steal, that kind of encompasses all the different skills that we as designers really need to be doing. And he talked about it accurately as what hiring managers are looking for. And I think it's true. This is what we at Living Social are hiring for. I'm sure it's what IBM is hiring for. But I think it also presents a pretty compelling case for how difficult it is to be in our industry today. I think what's important, though, is to say is that we don't need people who are specialists in every one of these skills, but what we're looking for is someone who's a generalist, who can know about these things, but also can use whichever one of these tools in their toolbox to provide value at every step in the product process. So when I started at Living Social, I probably could check maybe 3 of these boxes. I was more or less a UI designer, but since I've been there throughout the work we do, I've learned and become very good at some of these, at most of these, and be very good at some of them. But probably more importantly than the hard skills that these things are, I think what Living Social has allowed me to do is realize how to provide value and how to know which one of these things to use at every step. So whether that's the definition step or whatever, what have you. So it's more around the soft skills that I've developed rather than the hard skills. I mean, anyone can be a great Photoshop designer, but to understand business knowledge or ROI is more valuable to the company you work for or the clients you have if you're in an agency. So at Living Social, this is our product development process. I'm sure that this is not what everyone's product development process is, or you'll call it something different. But what I think is really important is that even if this isn't what you call it, or if you're not involved in every step of these things, this is how products are made, right? You define problems, you solve those problems, you build for those solutions, and you launch them. But I think at Living Social, what we're really hoping to do is, like I mentioned, we want UX designers to have value in each one of these sections. And I think that in the end is why we're calling ourselves product designers. So, you may be working in an organization where a product manager or a client is coming to you with a defined set of problems, or you're handing off mocks to an offshore developer during the build phase. But I think it's important that you guys take action to be valuable in each one of those. My boss says this a lot, and he says that we as a UX team should be wagging the dog at Living Social. And what that means is that we're not just reacting to prescribed problems as they're delivered to us, but that we're finding those problems, we're helping curate solutions, and even curate the problems around those, and finding out what they are. One anecdote that I really like about product designers is it's an interview technique if you ask someone to come in and redesign a form that isn't performing well. And the anecdote goes, a good designer will take that form and they will improve the labeling of the form, and maybe they'll do some good practices in form design to make an improvement. A great designer will combine fields or use things on the technology side to parse out the information. And then even further, a great designer will ask, well, why are we using a form? And I think that really, like as I mentioned, it gets to the soft skills. It's what's the best solution for the problems we have. Maybe a form isn't even the best tactic. Oops, sorry, I keep getting this Wi-Fi thing. So I'm sure you guys are all thinking, like, that's great, I do some of these things, but how do I do all of them? So Honey Boo Boo is going to help us out. So in the defined, what I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through each one of those processes and talk about how at Living Social we do some of these things and what are some tips and practices to do it. So in the defined section, I don't know about you guys, but in previous jobs I've worked in, this is something that usually lies with clients or product managers if you're an internal company. But this is something that UX can play a huge part in. We should be collaborative in the definition section. So I don't know how many of you guys have had this, but how often do you guys have your clients or your product managers come to you with a proposed solution rather than a problem? I'm sure that's happened to everybody here. You know, this could be something like someone coming to you being like, I need a sign-up email for my product, and you go into your whatever weapon of choice, Illustrator or Photoshop, you mock up your email with a big stinking sign-up button, and you pass it off and someone builds it. And that's great, but you may not, or you may have solved the problem, but since you weren't part of the problem crafting or the definition of that problem, you don't really know if you've solved the problem. You've done what was asked of you, but you didn't solve the problem. So at Living Social, we start off every project with a pretty simple step of crafting a problem statement. And this, we're not touching any designing, we're just simply talking about the problem we're trying to solve. So when we're doing that, the questions we need to answer are who's affected, when are they affected, what's the context of the problem, how can you measure, and what's your desired outcome. And we're not talking at this point really about KPIs, like what are the things we really want to focus on how to solve it, but really what we're doing is we're saying, this is the problem we're trying to solve, and this time, and throughout the entire process, we can always come back and say, is the solution we're working on now getting to this problem? What we really consider is a collective flag in the ground that a team can kind of coalesce around. So a couple other pieces I really want to talk about, though, with problem statements is you should rely on your past research. Especially if you've been working on similar projects or similar products for a long time, you should have a ton of research which may inform the way you're crafting your problem statements and make smart decisions based on that. At Living Social, we test our core product frequently. I have some of my user research team here today. And not only do we test with our users frequently, but we also we shadow our customer service representatives on the phone for their customer calls weekly. And we do that because it allows us to find trends in the feedback we're getting and the calls we're getting. And in that case, our UX team can be like a product manager where we're discovering and uncovering problems that we need to solve. So an example of a problem statement may be something like this. Merchants for Living Social don't always have access to a computer to redeem vouchers. And as a result, they're opening themselves up for fraud, and currently only 50% of all vouchers are redeemed. So this is a problem for us as a business, obviously, but we're not proposing any solutions. We haven't said anything about how we're going to solve this problem. We're simply saying this is the problem, and it answers all these questions on the left. So after you've defined a problem like this, you would move on to the design section. And this is probably something where designers here are very familiar with. This is, in previous jobs, the design phase for me was going into Photoshop or going into Illustrator and creating design mock-ups to then pass off. And in my previous example, you probably would have started designing an iOS app or a mobile web application with a big redeem button, and someone's going to come click that. But the thing that's interesting about the design phase is there's hundreds of different ways to solve any given problem. So to mitigate that paradox of choice, we start every design phase with a sketching session. And there's a few core tenets of the sketching sessions that are really important, but the biggest one is that you're including everyone in the team during the sketching session. So that means the product manager is involved in this, and the engineer is involved, and the designers are involved. Our sketching sessions tend to be about 5 or 6 people. We get people who have no relationship to this project as well to come in and just lend their expertise. And this is great because problems that may be surfacing on a typical project many months later, you're surfacing at the beginning of a project because all the stakeholders are present. So our sketching sessions are structured like this. They're 1 hour. We do 10 minutes of talking about the problem statement. We do 10 minutes of sketching individually. Then we do 10 minutes of sharing those sketches within the group. After that, we call the next 10-minute section the beg, borrow, and steal round. And that's where you take everything you've heard from your colleagues and you refine them and improve upon them for your second iteration. You share that again, and then the last 10 minutes of the sketching session, you guys kind of come together as a group and pick one solution and you refine it within those 10 minutes. And one of the benefits of a sketching session like this is you're coming away with a lot of different ideas in a very short amount of time. I've spent times in the past where I've worked on 5 different solutions in my own head, sitting on my desktop. It's taken me 2 weeks, and then I hand off those things for people to make choices about what they like best. If you do something like this, you've got low fidelity solutions, but you've gone through a lot of possible solutions in a very short amount of time. As I mentioned earlier, this surfaces problems. If you have the engineer in the room, you could find about engineering problems that you need to be aware of, and you've heard about that earlier. Another big thing is this really helps you prioritize the features that are important, that you as a team decide are important to solving the problem. And then, most importantly, and I mentioned this and I'll keep mentioning this, this really aligns the group. So you have a core group of people who are helping do this project, and you want everyone to be on the same page. How many of you guys have taken part in a sketching session similar to this? That's good. For those of you who haven't, and even for those of you who have, how many of you guys have started on a project without everyone being on the same page? Yeah. So obviously that shows a need for this. Hopefully anything you start this way, you're not starting out with being on the same page. And then the last thing, this is just more Living Social specific, but we found that engineers and product managers absolutely love being part of this. They're so used to having something where they present a problem and then the designers come back to them with something so rigid and something they've already feel really passionate about, and they feel like they didn't become part of the solution. They're just executing on a designer's ideas. Well, this means they're part of the solution. They're not just presenting problems or building someone else's ideas. They're part of the solution. So after the design concept, we move on to the prototyping phase. And prototyping is something I'm assuming you guys are all doing, and I know there were a bunch of talks that were given about it today, but I want to just touch on it a little bit. And I specifically want to say that prototyping doesn't need to be done by developers or front-end guys. It can be done by anyone, and it doesn't have to be super high fidelity. So as I mentioned in the sketching session, the goal of a prototype is that it needs to be testable. You're going to take this and you're going to test it with users. And what that means is the most important thing in prototype is about speed to get to that test. So you could spend weeks to come around with this beautiful HTML, CSS version of a prototype, but if you find out in your first test that no one likes the stuff you've done, you've just wasted a ton of time. So you really want to focus on the scenario, what I call the happy scenario, what gets you from point A to point Z based on your problem. Focus on that and get to a level of fidelity that is necessary for your testing. Not necessarily a level for product launch, but just for testing. So if you have a research team like I do, which would be awesome because they're great, thank you, Liz, you should ask them what they think is the level of fidelity necessary. But if they don't, trust your gut. You know that you personally are going to be doing the testing. You know you're going to have to go talk to users. So make sure you're going there with something you feel confident enough that is going to convey your ideas. And then one thing I would say, as I mentioned earlier, is the scenario. Just don't waste time on screens that are not part of the core solution until it's necessary. Don't worry about error states and things like that. You're going to know in the testing phase if a user is coming into something where the rubber's hitting the road, and you'll improve on that in the next step. But don't worry about it for now. So as I mentioned, I'm sure a lot of people are talking about prototyping, and I'm sure there's some people wondering, well, what type of prototypes are best? And the reality is not every designer is a coder. I've talked to a couple people today who are designers but don't code at all. I've talked to some who are basically front-end developers. It really doesn't matter at this point. You need to come up with whatever is going to get you there fast. So it doesn't matter if you code. Sid Harrell, who's a fantastic researcher, she's a big proponent of paper prototyping like this. At Living Social, we have a saying called JSIO, or just shit it out. And I think that really holds true for the prototyping stage. You just got to get something out there. You want to learn as much as you can, as quickly as you can. So you could do paper prototyping. This could come directly from your sketching session. Or you could do something a little bit more digital friendly, like the Paper app, or Pop app. How many people have used this? This is great. You take photos of your sketches, you create hit targets, and you can create something that mimics a native app in seconds. You could use Keynote or Prototype or PowerPoint. I've done this a lot. I use GUIs like this one from Tihan and Lax that allows you to create something that looks like a native specific app in a very short amount of time. And I imagine everyone here has Keynote or Prototype on their computer, so it's super simple and easy to use. And again, it helps you focus on the solution rather than like the perfect pixels that a Photoshop or Illustrator may make you focus on. And then this is another app which I'll just pimp because I really love it, is an app called Blueprint app, and this is on iPad. It does a lot of the same things that Keynote does. It just has a lot of very native iOS controls, so it helps a lot. And this, you just pull screens in from your camera roll or from Dropbox, and you can create flows right there in the app. So these are all different things that I have used, and I'm sure people have talked about even more. Has anyone here used Macaw? Anyone heard about that? Macaw, yeah. So Macaw is a tool made by some people, some really, really smart people here in Living Social, or not in Living Social, in DC, excuse me. And it's a responsive design tool, which is really cool if you want to test a bunch of different designs on a bunch of different devices. And then the last thing, at the same conference I went to at Jared Spool, I also did a workshop on jQuery Mobile. I'm constantly trying out new tools to see what's best to use. And I don't know if you've used jQuery Mobile, but there's a ton of stuff out of the box that's really fantastic. In half a day, I was able to come up with a really, really great prototype. And I would really heartily recommend it if you have really interactive, heavy prototypes, like form design or things that require inputs or a bunch of different drop downs, things like that that maybe are more difficult to fake in a JPEG setting. So then the next part is to test that prototype you have. I just wanted to mention, our process is really based off of agile methodology, which in lean UX methodology, they call for something called validate internally. And the reason I'm bringing that up because we don't do that. And the reason we don't do that is because we have already incorporated and collaborated with stakeholders throughout this process. And if you're doing that, you don't need to validate with your boss. They were there when you were doing the sketching session. If you're communicating, collaborating well, you can effectively remove an entire step. So we move right directly on to testing. And doing user research is something I had no experience with before Living Social. I did primarily business to business, UI design, and now I'm working at a product company that does user research on a weekly basis. So I can say that I am converted. I absolutely adore this. It's great to be able to sitting in those sessions and find out from users what problems they're having that may seem intuitive to you, but that are not for your core users. So the important thing about user research is that as a product designer, this may be something that be owned by a completely different team, but even if you have a research team, you should be able to contribute to the scripting of this test. You should be present at the test so that you're hearing directly from the mouth of the users that you're having problems with. And if you don't have a research team and you have no skills in user research, I would just say, just fake it till you make it. Get out there and do it. If you have a really specific user for your product, start recruiting early. And try and get a good cohort of people who you can test with often. And if you have a really general audience for your product, I would go to Starbucks, go Gorilla. One of the things we've done at Living Social is we go down to the Starbucks, we offer to pay for a user's coffee while they're waiting in line if they'll just use our app and give us some feedback right then and there. So like $25 later, you've got 5 users who've come in, they've run through your test in 10 minutes, and you're out the door, and you got a ton of feedback. Jacob Nielsen, who's a fantastic researcher, he says 5 users is enough to uncover 80% of usability problems. So that's not a lot of time, and you can get a lot of information quickly. One other tip is, we use a number scale rating. Something that's kind of interesting is we hear a lot of 1s and 2s or 9s and 10s, but we still keep that scale because it allows us to quantify people's feelings about how they're using the product, and we ask oftentimes, how can you take someone who's a 1 and 2 into a 5, 6, or even higher? And one thing I would say is, especially in a mobile setting, if you're getting lots of 1s and 2s, just scrap the feature. Especially over time, if you keep iterating on it, just scrap it. Don't cloud your interface, especially in a mobile setting, with features no one wants. And I would say don't be considering your product for launch until you can get most people in the 9s and 10s. You need to have a high expectation for your products. So the main questions when you're testing, obviously I've got them over here in the speech bubble, but is can you accomplish a task? Would you accomplish this task if I wasn't here asking you to do it? And if you did it, would you recommend it to your friends? So after you've tested, the next step is the learn and iterate phase. And these things happen together, and they're happening constantly and over time. But the important parts of this is that you want to keep what's working and scrap the things that aren't. I mentioned this earlier just a second ago, is if people don't like it, get rid of it. But also, this is a lot about pace. So I mentioned at Living Social, we test like almost every week. that is not comfortable for some people, but the point of this all is that you're getting valuable learnings as fast as possible. So, find what's comfortable for you and your team and get there quickly. You don't want to be 3 months down the line and find out that your proposed solution isn't working for your users. That's wasting a ton of time. And more importantly, you don't want to get this to a build team and start building things that aren't working. I prescribe to the idea that your first idea is very rarely your best idea. So this is how you get to your best idea in a short amount of time. And then the other thing I would say is you're going to keep doing this until you feel like you've hit a good launch candidate. So the last step really before launch is the build step. And obviously, build typically lives with your engineers and your front-end team. But again, this is not something that you just pass off to them and then let them be done. You should become an integral part of this step in the process. I recently read an article just last week that said, your customers are visiting your website because of your product, your content, or your service, not to admire your design. And that really held true to me. Like, you can make a beautiful thing, but if your content sucks or it's shittily organized, no one's going to use it. So because of that, you should be collaborating with your engineers on the server side and creating content structures that support your current product and any future ideas for your product. Whoops, sorry guys. And any future ideas for your product. And then also, good performance is good design. I put this stat up there because it's really important. I think 74% of mobile visitors will abandon your site if it takes longer than 5 seconds to load. And I'm going to assume that most people here, if you think about your own use of your phone, that is true. I see some nodding heads. And I know at Living Social that's true. If we can't get you a deal in a short period of time, no one's going to buy that deal. So that means as a user experience designer or a product designer, you need to think about that. You could design the most beautiful page in the world, but if no one's going to see it, no one's going to use it. And then the other thing that's kind of important to think about this is if you really care about this and you're working with your engineers, you're going to gain favor with the engineers. And that they'd be more likely to make concessions for you in the future. And I would also just kind of like offshoot, Living Social, we grew really, really quickly and really, really big in a short amount of time. And we're kind of suffering from some short-sightedness on the side of how we built our products. And I think that's because it was because of the speed with which we grew, but also because we didn't think about some of our future ideas for the content we have, and we're suffering from this now. Obviously, we're making a lot of changes to make sure that we can catch up to that. But the more people you can have involved in the setting up of your content and your server-side choices, the better. Because an engineer might not be thinking about what the product's going to look like in 2 years, and you as a designer might be. And then the last thing I'll say about the build process is be heavily involved in the QA process. Fit and finish makes a huge difference for your users. And we as designers are probably spending hours and hours and making thousands and thousands of intent-driven decisions for your design. And it'd be a shame if you're not involved in the engineering process to make sure those decisions you made are making their way to your users. And then the last step really is, good design is never done. So once you've launched something, that doesn't mean your job is over with. You should be in charge of going back and checking through your KPIs, making sure you've done everything, check your analytics. And if it's not doing what you anticipated it to do, make tweaks. Keep going back. Use A/B testing, which we do a lot of. But if A/B testing is still not getting you where you want, consider it an entire pivot. I've been working at Living Social for 3 years. We change our stuff all the time. And I think it's important. Like I said, it's never done. And also the landscape of your users changes all the time. So obviously if your users are changing, your product needs to change with them. So thank you. I'm Will again. Thank you.